In the world of literature, there is no other book like the Bible. Welcome to the wonder of His Word.
It's good and great to have you with us again. This is going to be a very interesting subject today because we're actually dealing with a very, very familiar narrative found in the Bible. I'm sure that many of you know about Noah's flood. I'm sure you have many questions about that. Well, we're going to look at what the scriptures have to say in terms of Noah's flood. I'm taking the reading from the book of Genesis chapter 6, and we're going to glean from these inspired pages some thoughts and information that may help you to understand Noah's flood a little better. So let's have a look. Now it came to pass that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful or fair to look upon, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Now, that's a very, very interesting passage, because it raises certain questions, doesn't it? And that is, who are the daughters of men, and who are the sons of God? Why is this the preamble to the narrative of the flood, Noah's flood? Well, first and foremost, may I say that it would appear that the human race had taken on a hybrid nature, and because it had become a hybrid race and not what God authentically designed, God was going to send the flood in order to destroy that hybrid race so that He could once again restore His original plan for the earth and for mankind. However, there are those that obviously will consider these two verses not to be talking about any sort of hybrid relationship, but they would say that this simply means the daughters of men. The daughters of men would have been referred to as the children of Cain. That's a concept. Remember, Cain killed his brother Abel. We considered that earlier. And then the sons of God would have been that new line of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. Seth seemed to replace the genealogy or the purpose of Abel that had been killed by Cain. So many commentators, and they have very, very good intentions in suggesting this, that the daughters that were born, the daughters of men, is referring to the genealogy and the daughters that came from Cain, merely men. But the sons of God were those who continued the lineage from Adam, namely Seth. As I said, Abel had been murdered, and now Seth replaces Abel as a son of God. Now that is a concept which I don't believe this passage is teaching. However, many people deduct that that's the reason why it talks about the sons of God and the daughters of men. But let's have a look at what and who are the sons of God. If one has to just turn to the passage of Job, which is also in the Old Testament, one would consider in Job 2 what the Bible has to say in terms of who the sons of God really are. And in Job chapter 2, verse 1, it indicates that the sons of God came before Almighty God, and Satan also came. They came to give a report. Now, this seems to have been a big conference with the fallen angels and the angels who had not rebelled against God. And in this massive conference, they had raised certain objections. And the Bible, therefore, in Job 2, verse 1, refers to the sons of God as angels. So if one is going to be consistent, one would have to deduct that Genesis chapter 6 is referring to fallen angels, the angels who had left their first estate. Now, that becomes even more pronounced and underscored and supported in Scripture when we consider the penultimate book of the Bible, and that is the book of Jude. And in Jude only has one chapter. In Jude 6, that's verse 6, it says the following: "And the angels who did not keep their proper domain or estate, but left their own estate or abode, God has reserved them in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Now we know that the fallen angels are not bound, but these particular fallen angels are bound. What is Jude talking about? He is talking about Genesis chapter 6 angels who had fallen and had left their first estate, in other words, left their celestial role and had intermingled with mankind. Because if you continue in the narrative of Genesis chapter 6 with Noah's flood, you will find the following. And the Lord said, my spirit will not always strive with man forever. For he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore them children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now that's not presenting a reputation that is a positive one, men of renown. It just means that they left a legacy. And the legacy that they actually left was that they had affected the human gene pool. That God had to do something about destroying this hybrid race that had emerged through an unholy relationship between women, humans, on the earth, and the fallen angels who had now left their first estate, their celestial role, and had taken on the form of man, had relationships with the women. They conceived and brought forth this hybrid race, a hybrid race of giants. Now, when we talk of giants, don't think of Jack and the Beanstalk, because the giants that the Bible makes reference to are just exceptionally, abnormally large bodies. And that's what they had. Some of them were 9 foot tall, others were 12 foot tall. That's pretty big. Can you imagine having those guys in a rugby team? They could be fantastic in the line-out in particular. But now, getting back to this very, very important passage, dealing with Noah's flood, the Lord sends the flood to destroy that hybrid race. That was the reason why he sent the flood. He didn't only send the flood because these people were evil, indeed they were, but he sent the flood in order to purge earth from this unholy relationship and judge them. Noah's flood was a judgment against the fallen angels who had now taken on the form of men. Now, many people might object to that because in the Gospels we are taught that the angels cannot procreate. But remember, these angels had left their first estate. In other words, left the realm of the metaphysical, the spiritual, had taken on a human form in order to have relationships with women on a human level. So procreation became possible by the angels only because they had taken on human flesh, if that makes sense. And therefore, the conception of these children that were conceived from this unholy relationship would have actually led to this awful, awful situation that God says it wasn't pleasing to him. And he even felt that it was a great pity that man had developed or possibly degenerated into the state that they had. And therefore, God does something about it. He sends Noah's flood. And only Noah, his sons, and the 3 women married to the 3 sons of Noah, the 8 of them were the only ones who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now, there was something very, very special about those women that would mean that they could not have come from that hybrid race. It also meant that Noah and his wife, of course her name was Mrs. Noah, the point is that they had 3 children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And it would certainly, by implication of what the Bible implicitly states, and that is there would have been many, many people who had become affected by this defect or corruption of the gene pool. But this hadn't affected the family of Noah. And they were secured. But he had to prepare a boat. Now, the interesting thing is that the Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 2 that it never rained on the earth before Noah's day. There was a canopy that covered the earth. The belief, therefore, was that the earth used to run on its axis. At the moment, it runs off its axis. It ran on its axis. There was a canopy of nebula, which means very, very thick, dense cloud that covered the earth. The mist used to go up from the earth and would water all of the plants and everything on earth. But when the flood took place, something cataclysmic occurred. And that is, the canopy broke. It started to flood. It started to rain, which it had never done up to that point. And the depths of the earth started to spew out much of its water. And this is what actually flooded the earth. Now, when we speak of the earth in Noah's day, we're looking at a very, very different earth to what you and I are aware of. And that is, in Noah's day, the earth was a mass of land and then the sea. That was the difference between earth, the land mass, and the sea. So Mesopotamia, which is an ancient area which was just one mass of land, it is believed that that was the area that was really flooded. In other words, many people believe that Noah's flood was local and it wasn't universal. In other words, most of the earth was already covered by water, at least 2/3 of it. But with Noah's flood, it covered that area, that land mass. So therefore it was localized. And every living thing was in actual fact destroyed. Now, that gives an answer to many questions that arise. Well, if Noah got all the animals in the ark, how did he manage to get the kangaroo from Australia? How did he get some of these exotic birds from various other islands that are only indigenous to those islands? Well, if there was one land mass, getting the animals into the ark would not have been a problem. It was only after Noah's flood, and many years after, that the continental drift took place, that the continents broke up from the land mass. And if you look at the earth, you will look at the various continents, you could actually fit them together like a jigsaw puzzle. So there was what is known as the continental drift. The Bible also tells us about that in the book of Genesis. It tells us in Genesis chapter 10 that the earth was then divided, that the continents and the continental drift actually occurred long after Noah's day. That's after people had settled in various areas. Then the continental drift took place. That is the reason why you have all of these people who developed their own gene pool in those various areas that were broken up, that became very different in their looks and in their appearance as they adapted to the natural habitat. So on the basis of that, I think that the book of Genesis introduces us to some very, very intriguing answers. Now, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were known as the fathers or the progenitors or the patriarchs of the three dominant classifications of human beings. The Caucasoid people, those who call themselves Caucasian, those folks who have a lighter skin, came from the lineage of Japheth, one of the sons of Noah. The other group, known as the Mongoloid, and the Mongoloid are the Eastern people, from which you have your Asiatic people, your Eastern communities and races would have emerged from that particular source. And then the other progenitor was Ham. And Ham is considered by most people who know the scriptures that Ham was the father of the Negroid people. So there are three very dominant race groups throughout the world today, and that is the Caucasoid, the Negroid, and the Mongoloid. And if we consider that, it answers some of the questions in terms of why are we all so different. What is interesting is that the only way in which they could populate those areas if there was one land mass. So after the continental drift took place, all of those at the Tower of Babel, many of you, we're going to learn a little bit more about the Tower of Babel. This is when it was split up. After the Tower of Babel, when people had their own cultures, their own languages, etc., the continental drift took place, and that is why you have a fragmentation of the human race. I trust that you have found that very interesting. God bless you.